Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm here to talk about my thoughts on the HBO adaptation of The Last of Us Season 1, and full disclosure here, I am a massive fan of the original Last of Us. It is my favorite game of all time. It is my favorite narrative of all time, not just within the video game medium, but throughout all of media. And I have a Last of Us video in the works for the 10-year anniversary of the game later this year that I go in excruciating detail about how much I adore the game, to where it is going to be my longest video of all time. So again, I am a massive fan of the original game. So the thing is, what did I think of the show? It was good, but I do have issues. And I will say, again, I adore the original Last of Us so much. Obviously, I will have a lot of bias towards it. Again, I literally just spent a ridiculous amount of time analyzing the original story of The Last of Us. And to me, the HBO adaptation here is good for what it is. I just think the game does it better. And I think there's a myriad of reasons for that. I think you have the video game medium being one that I think allows you to connect to the characters a lot better than a TV show does. And through that, again, they make a lot of changes for the show. Some of them I think are apt for having to translate this to the television medium, while I think others not so much in my eyes. And really, I think there's a lot of minor changes across the show that do just bother me. And I think they make a lot of changes to certain character motivations, to the thematic messaging of things, to how blatant the thematic messaging of things are, that do bother me. Now, again, at the end of the day, I think this show is good. I think if you have not played the original Last of Us, or haven't really done a deep dive into analyzing the story of The Last of Us, I think you can come out of this show adoring it, thinking it is one of the best shows ever made. And I understand that is the opinion of most people that watch this show. However, again, I just feel like the game does it better. And I will be talking about the reasons why. I'll be going through every episode, talking about my thoughts along the way. Now, I will say this will be including spoilers for the entirety of the Last of Us series, including part 2. So if you've only watched the show and don't want to know what happens in part 2, which will end up being seasons 2 and probably 3, I recommend that you don't watch this video, as again, I will definitely be referencing things that happen later down the road. But let's start talking about the show. Episode 1, we start with this cold open of this scene from 1968 from this talk show about them talking about fungal infections and describing the cordyceps. And I don't have much of an issue with this. I don't love it either, personally. I think it's fine. Like, obviously, it's introducing you to the concept of the world. However, I also feel like it's not something I deem as necessary. And I think this plays into kind of an issue I had with like earlier episodes here, in the fact that I do feel like we spend so much time setting up the apocalypse, setting up the infection, to the point where I do think it takes away from the time that we spend on the characters. Where to me, The Last of Us has always been a story of Joel and Ellie that just so happens to take place in this post-apocalypse. While I feel like the approach that seemed to be taken early on here is the complete opposite. It felt like they focused more so on the infection, and it felt like the characters were secondary to that. But then we finally get to the main characters, where we start off in 2003 instead of 2013. Again, they start at 10 years different, so that the 20-year time jump would take place in the modern day instead of the outbreak happening in the modern day, which is what happened when it originally came out. Again, not a major deal to me, but we do obviously start off focusing on Sarah. And I will say most of what they've done with Sarah in the show, I really liked. Now, again, I don't think this would have been good for a video game medium. I think this is one of the things that I do think in the translation to TV, they changed it for the better. I do feel like, again, like if these scenes of Sarah and Joel eating breakfast, then talking to their neighbor, and then her in school, and then her fixing the watch, and like if all these scenes were in the game, it would just simply not work. But I do think it works very well for the show, and I think it kind of works in the same way that us playing as Sarah works in the original game, where I think in the original game, you can connect so much more to Sarah because you spend the early portions of the game playing as her. While in the show here, you can't have that connection, obviously. And I think us following Sarah throughout her first day here and having this much more expanded role for her, I do think serves that role pretty well. So again, I feel like the Sarah stuff in episode 1 here, I actually really liked. And I thought Nico Parker as Sarah was fantastic. I thought she was pretty perfect there. Obviously, throughout this, we get introduced to Joel as well, played by Pedro Pascal, who, again, was good as Joel. I will say it is a different Joel. Like, I never watched Pedro Pascal and thinking, oh, this is Joel from the video game. But I thought he was good. I thought he was good in the role. Again, I'll have complaints with the direction of his character later on, but I think his actual performance here as Joel was pretty solid. And the same thing goes with Gabriel Luna as Tommy. I mean, he sounded just like Tommy, which is pretty insane to me. And again, I think overall his performance here was pretty solid. But again, we spent a lot of time with Sarah before the events of when the game starts, so before the apocalypse outbreak. Though eventually we do lead up to nighttime, where we get the first scene that is directly taken from the game, where we do see Sarah and Joel on the couch, her giving him the watch. We get the hardcore drug line. And I will say, for me, a lot of this word for word adaptation of the game didn't work for me as much. I feel like a lot of these scenes, I just think the game does it better. Mind you, I think this is one of those that it's fine either way. However, I think many scenes down the road, I really just do not like as much as the original. But again, this all leads up to Sarah getting up, and we essentially get the opening scene of the game, though playing out a bit differently, where here, instead of Joel being chased by the neighbor and him having to kill him, instead Sarah ends up going to the neighbor's house and ends up finding the grandma there, having killed everyone inside, which I really found this scene really over the top. I did think this was kind of ridiculous. I feel like the show does this multiple times of utilizing this trope of this like unexpected person end up being a zombie, where here it's a grandma, later we get a kid. And I feel like those kind of scenes bother me, but not a major deal. Either way, Joel saves Sarah eventually, and we get the same drive sequence as on the show, pretty much word for word, which was all pretty cool to see. Where again, I think this played out mostly pretty well. And this all leads up to them driving through town. All this plays out the same until the way that the car crashes is not from another car crashing into them like it is in the original, but from an entire plane crashing behind them, which is ridiculous. Like, it's so over the top. But either way, we get the same thing of Sarah being carried out by Joel, gets separated from Tommy, and again, we eventually get to obviously the Sarah death scene, which I thought this was, again, one of the few scenes that plays out like the original that I thought had the same impact as the original. I thought this was truly gut-wrenching to see Sarah, who again is so brilliantly acted by Nico Parker, die in this way here. Again, for me, it had the same amount of impact that it did for me when I originally played the game. Even with the knowledge that it was coming, I really thought this was, again, beautifully recreated here. But this ends up taking us to 20 years later, obviously just like the game. However, we started off differently than in the game. Where in the game, when we get 20 years later, we instantly start following Joel once again as he awakens. However, here we change that up, where instead we end up following a kid who ends up showing up to the Boston quarantine zone, where obviously the kid ends up being infected and they end up putting him down, leading to us finally getting reunited with Joel, as he ends up being the one to end up burning this kid's dead body. I find this characterization of Joel here to be very confusing, where it feels so weird to me that Joel, beyond this scene, see this more emotional side of Joel moving forward and how he isn't as hardened of an individual as he is in the original game, yet he's in this moment holding this kid just like he held Sarah and doesn't seem to care at all. Despite so much of the story really beating you over the head with how much Joel feels like he failed Sarah back in the day. Again, the fact that he's just okay with holding this kid and burning them here just feels kind of ridiculous to me. But either way, this was actually supposed to be the end of episode 1, but instead we're only halfway through because they decided to mix episodes 1 and 2 into one, which I do think is a choice probably for the better. I do think ending episode 1 without us even meeting Ellie, not really knowing where the story is going moving forward, I do feel like that would have been a mistake. So I do think that decision was a proper one. My issue is that I really don't like the second half of episode 1. Where again, if you think I've been complaining about the first half of episode 1, I actually liked the first half of episode 1. I hated the second half of episode 1. And let's get into it. Again, a lot of this is kind of taking a similar formula to the first half of the episode in the sense that, again, we have these basic events that need to happen. However, I feel like in this part of the episode in particular, they're expanding upon it in a way that takes away from the original story. Where to me, in the original story, again, while this is a trope of video games and the fact that yes, we are following Joel the entire time and seeing only Joel's perspective, for me that boons the story. Again, it is a story that is based around the characters of Joel and Ellie. It is a focused story because of the fact that we are following Joel throughout all of these events. However, in the show here, we don't follow Joel for really a lot of this episode. We end up getting a lot of moments with Tess, with Marlene, with Ellie, and these things kind of muddy up the episode in my eyes. Now again, these aren't necessarily bad scenes in their own right, but I do feel like in terms of the focus of the story of The Last of Us, I do feel like it doesn't keep it as focused as I want it to be. Where again, like the scene of Tess being interrogated by Robert is a great scene, is a great introduction to Tess. Though to me is one that doesn't really add much to the story here, especially considering Tess's overall role in the story moving forward. Now, I should also mention that obviously they changed up a lot with Robert, who, again, he spent a lot of the early game chasing down Robert after he's betrayed you. Again, they did change that up radically here. However, I actually don't mind this change. Again, I do understand that the game and the TV show are different and you are going to have to change things. And the game really utilizes the chase for Robert to act as a tutorial to a lot of the game systems. And again, that is not necessary in the TV show. And I get them changing this here. I actually don't mind it. But again, it is these other changes that do bother me. Changes like having this entire scene of Marlene talking to the Fireflies and talking about the plan of escaping the quarantine zone. And again, this is like cool context on what the Fireflies were doing in Boston. However, also, this scene is like a very weird one to me, where a lot of the dialogue didn't feel very natural here. It felt like a lot of exposition that kind of bothered me. Though I will say that I do think Marlene is still portrayed very well here, obviously being portrayed by the original actress, who again, I still think does a pretty good job here. We obviously get introduced to Ellie, who has this opening scene that everyone seemed to love, yet I hated, of Ellie being tied up and being like told to count up, and then she just says F you, and it's like to me, just as a whole, I did not like the TV show's interpretation of Ellie. Now, this is not on Bella Ramsey, as I do feel like Bella Ramsey does well with the material that she is given. However, I think the overall interpretation of Ellie is vastly different than it is in the game, and I do very much prefer the game's interpretation. Now, I do get what the show is going for, where again, they give Ellie this much colder demeanor. I think the interpretation is that, okay, she's from this post-apocalyptic world, so she should have this colder worldview. Though for me, one, I don't like this in the sense that, for me, Ellie has always been the light in the darkness. She has always been this more sheltered figure that has this childish glee when she exits the quarantine zone. Like, she is understanding of people. She's not this pretty vindictive, cold individual that we see throughout the show. And while there are moments of her feeling like the game Ellie, I do feel like there are many other moments that just don't feel like Ellie in my eyes. And also, what I find strange about it too is that the rationale for changing Ellie here is something that they don't even keep consistent with future characters, which we will talk about. But really, the biggest thing for me in this entire part of the episode that really bothered me is everything they did with Joel and his connection to Tommy, where people have been praising this part of the episode of that Joel is dealing with Robert here, not for this like arbitrary pools of weapons that they lost, but because he wants to get a car battery so that he can escape Boston and find Tommy, who had supposedly left not too long ago and is in Wyoming, and that he feels like he needs to save Tommy. And I hate this so much. To me, this completely recontextualizes Joel's character in a way that I really hate. I hate that they made Joel openly care about Tommy. To me, what makes the character of Joel and his eventual development over the course of the original Last of Us so impactful is how broken he is after Sarah's death. To me, the moment of Sarah's death should break Joel to where he is at the point where he is only just surviving, to where that eventually causes his relationship with Tommy to fade away. Here instead, Joel is trying to rescue Tommy and still cares about Tommy, and later on talks about how you survive for family, with Tommy being the reason he's surviving, I guess. To me, this makes Joel's overall character arc across this story so much less impactful for me, where he's just simply not as broken as he is in the original game. In the original game, again, Sarah is his life. That is everything to him. While here, this makes it feel like, okay, Sarah was a lot, but he had Tommy, he had Tess, he had other things going on. Where again, it feels like this show is so hung up on the concept of being a protector and having to continuously reiterate that theme over and over and over again, to the point where, to me, it takes away the impact from the initial premise of Joel's character and the initial reason for why Joel is the way he is. And I get why they do it. I just personally don't like this interpretation of Joel nearly as much as I like the original. Speaking of that, I really hate also the scene of Tess getting into bed with Joel. I feel like this was also another thing that I really hate. And I feel like this is just in general the thing with the show too. I feel like it just has a lessened level of nuance to it. I feel like there's so many things that are more blatantly told to you, where in the original game, they didn't need to tell you that Joel and Tess were in a relationship. While it is implied multiple times, they don't need to blatantly tell you like they do here, of literally having Tess get in bed with Joel, which I found that dumb as well. But either way, again, we end up skipping a lot of the hunting down of Robert, and I think that's, again, justly so. I don't think we really needed a lot of that. But this eventually leads to us finding Robert at what ends up being the Fireflies base, which again, I think consolidating all these storylines into one, I think that's pretty solid. But again, here we have this interaction between Joel and Tess and Marlene and Ellie, which again is done differently than the game, but again, not in a really detrimental way to me. And again, ends up playing out similarly here, of them agreeing to take Ellie to the state house. And we have Marlene blatantly telling Joel to not fuck this up, because they have to continuously repeat the themes of Joel being a failure over and over again. But eventually we get the same scene of Joel and Ellie's first true interaction, of a similar conversation of Joel telling Ellie to kill time and Joel being really dismissive of her, though Ellie tells him that his watch is broken. Again, also a really solid scene. Here we do have them escaping the quarantine zone, to where again they are found by the military, just like the game. However, this time it's only one officer that ends up finding them, this being an officer that Joel interacted with earlier. Though again, I really hate how they handled this scene here, where again it feels like the show just has no level of subtlety to it. It has to blatantly tell you that, hey, Joel defending Ellie here, this is just like Joel defending Sarah. It's like, yeah, I get it. It just happened. You don't need to tell me blatantly that this is supposed to refer back to that. And like, I feel like this is just the thing. It's like, I feel like the HBO show here didn't want to risk things going over people's heads. Or like the original Last of Us, again, there's so much subtlety to that story, almost all of which is like just blatantly explained to you within the show, or at least they make more attempts to make it more apparent in the show. And that is something that, again, I am personally bothered by. But either way, they find out Ellie's infected. She explains that she's immune, which I feel like a lot of this came off as very abrupt, especially considering we literally end the episode immediately following this with them escaping into the contamination zone. And again, I just felt like this happened really quick. It's not like a major complaint. However, I do feel like there was more gravitas in the original. But then we get to episode 2, which strangely also ends up starting off with another cold open like episode 1, with a flashback to 2003 in Jakarta, Indonesia, where we have this professor of mycology who inspects one of the first infected, and this was a solid scene. I do think it was well portrayed, especially from the main actress within it. However, it's another scene that I largely just find unnecessary, and to me, like, again, like, takes away some of the focus from Joel and Ellie, but not to a ridiculous degree. I think something within a TV medium that makes this palatable to me is the fact that this was all pre-credits, and I think through that, it kind of feels like the credits are this, like, break-off point anyway. So I don't mind them adding a story like this, even though, again, I didn't feel like it was a necessity to me. But again, it was a well-made scene for what it is. But I do find it weird that, again, this gave me the vibe that we were just going to be starting off every episode with a flashback like this, and we just don't, which I just found to be really strange. That, like, why did we even get this here then? But either way, we follow this up with Ellie awakening in the middle of the room, only to find Joel and Tess watching over her, pointing their guns at her. And instantly we do see Tess believing her, Old Joel talks about wanting to send her back, again, kind of in line with the original game. Though throughout all this, though, we do also strangely have Ellie just taking out a sandwich that Marlene packed for her and eating it, which it's like, what? Especially considering a later revelation that the cordyceps came from grain. It's like, why is she eating a sandwich? Like, why is bread even a thing anymore? But whatever. But eventually when leaving this room, we do see that they are right outside the wrecked downtown buildings from the original game. These buildings that they don't ever go in, which just make them a video game Easter egg, I guess. And we do get a lot of the initial interactions between characters here, particularly around Tess and Ellie. But here we also have Ellie mentioning that she's heard rumors of clickers and bloaters, which felt weird to me. Now, obviously in the original game, she doesn't know about these things. And when she does find out about these things, these are meant to be moments of allowing these explanations to Ellie to also be explanations to the player. I feel like that was a much more effective way in introducing clickers and bloaters to me than this random throwaway line. This eventually leads to them trying to cut through a hotel, which they took from the Pittsburgh section of the game and moved it up to here, which, I mean, like, to be fair, is not an issue at all. Like, it's completely fine. And I actually feel like this is actually a pretty solid scene. Again, being the first scene that Ellie truly feels like a kid in this moment. Again, it's taken straight from the game of her playing around with the bell and Joel calling her a weird kid. And like I felt like that was a decent moment there. And we do get the first bit of downtime just between Joel and Ellie, to where he ignores pretty much all of her questions. But here, this eventually leads to talk about the guy that he killed. And really, this ends up leading to another one of like my minor complaints with Ellie's portrayal across this season. The fact that we do end up seeing Ellie in the moments where Joel is protecting her early on and doing these really ruthless things, killing these people, that she seems to enjoy this, which I get conceptually, this concept of, okay, Ellie wants a protector, which that does fit in line with the original game. However, I also feel like this also takes away from the concepts in the original game. It takes away this like gleeful innocence from Ellie, and also ends up kind of changing her character development to a degree, where this obviously ends up playing into part 2, where by the time part 2, a lot of Ellie's story in that game is her trying to be like Joel and realizing that she can't be like Joel. She isn't Joel. She can't do these ruthless, brutal things and not be dehumanized to it. However, it feels like the show is trying to set that up, but doing it in a way that makes it seem like Ellie is also dehumanized to it to a degree, and her enjoying that Joel is doing these things for her, which I just find kind of strange in itself. But eventually, Tess ends up getting back with the group, to where they end up arriving at a patio area where they realize that they can't move forward because there's a group of infected on the ground floor, which is where we get a bit of a change to the infected for the show, where we learn that they're all connected and how they grow underground and they essentially work in hordes. And this is a change that I think is cool conceptually. I think if they utilized it effectively moving forward, I do think this would have been, again, a change, obviously, to the original, but one that's not super detrimental. However, I don't feel like they end up doing that much with this moving forward, to the point where it does make it feel largely unnecessary. It also feels like another instance in my eyes of them feeling the need to further dive into the concept of the infection, which is something that just doesn't matter to me. Either way, this leads to them deciding to now go through the museum instead, though this is where we get our first encounter with the clicker, which again in the game, this takes place in the downtown buildings, though I felt like this was a pretty decent action sequence here of Joel having to fight against it and protecting Ellie, though Tess obviously gets separated from them along the way, which is obviously where she gets bit. Also, Ellie gets bit during this scene, to which she says, well, if it's gonna happen to one of us, which obviously adding to this irony with us eventually learning that Tess got bit. But then we get to the top of the museum, again, similar scene of Ellie crossing the beam, this iconic visual from the game, and we get the same conversation between Joel and Ellie as they look at the view. Well, this leads up to them getting to the Capitol building finally, which once inside, again, we get a recreation of the scene from the game. One that, again, I do feel like the original game was probably better in my eyes. Now, I do think Tess as a whole in the show is good, though to me, again, it just feels like a different portrayal of Tess. It never felt very similar at all to the video game version of Tess, though here we have Tess showing Joel Ellie's new bite as the proof to Ellie being immune, which, again, just feels like the reason why they had her bit earlier. Again, a minor change there that isn't too bothersome. But something I do find very strange about all this is that this is where Tess tasks Joel not with taking Ellie to Tommy, but instead taking Ellie to Bill and Frank, which is weird. And also, like, what's the point when we know that he wants to go to Jackson anyway to meet with Tommy? It's like none of this actually makes sense in my eyes, which I should also mention, kind of ridiculous, the entire concept of Joel already planning on going to Tommy's to begin with him wanting to get the car battery, but now also has another reason to go to Tommy's because of Ellie, but whatever. This all leads up to the eventual Tess death scene, which is obviously very different here than in the original game, and I'm a bit conflicted on how exactly I feel about it. Where in the original game, I will say that I do think Tess sacrificing herself to a group of human enemies feels more right to me thematically. However, it also doesn't really make that much of logical sense that Fedra would follow them all the way out there into this contamination zone. So while I do think Tess being killed by infected like she is in this episode, while not as thematically satisfying to me, I actually do think it still works. Though obviously we get the really strange scene of one of the infected going and kissing S, which just felt very weird. Like, Ozzy connects to this like theme of that all the infected are connected and that she's already infected considering she's already been bitten, but this also feels bizarre that all these infected are running into the building except for this one that just goes and walks up to her. Also, I didn't like the aspect of Tess struggling to light the lighter, and she just so happens to get it right before she gets killed, which that ends up being really stupid to me. But either way, I actually ended up coming out of episode 2 being more positive on the show than I was after episode 1, even though I still have these complaints here and there. But that takes us to episode 3, which is very interesting, the fact that this is obviously the episode that got a lot of praise, with some people calling it one of the greatest hours of television of all time. And I will say it is very, very good. I think as its own individual standalone episode, the story of Bill and Frank, it is fantastic. But I still have minor nitpicks here and there. And also, I really just prefer the game's interpretation of Bill and his purpose in the story more than Bill and Frank's here. But again, still good either way. But again, the beginning of the episode does focus on Joel and Ellie as they walk towards Bill's town now, to which we do get a solid interaction between the two when talking about Tess, where Ellie tells him to not blame her for something that isn't her fault, which again, you can take at face value, though in reality, it really is just Ellie trying to lie to herself in that situation, where she believes that she is to blame. But eventually they end up arriving at Cumberland Farms, where Joel has a stash of supplies, and we get the arcade machine scene from the game, though this time with Mortal Kombat instead of angel knives. But this leads to Ellie just randomly going off on her own for a couple minutes, which felt very strange that Joel just like for some reason didn't pay attention to where she was going despite being super controlling of her otherwise. But she ends up finding an infected under some rubble, and you see her cutting its forehead, and I mean, this is a solid scene of Ellie like trying to figure out what's going on with the infected here and the humanity of them. But either way, we eventually continue forward to where Joel and Ellie end up talking about the outbreak, to where we get the reveal that the outbreak started from flour, which was obviously a theory that had been in the works up to this point, with a lot of references to in episodes 1 and 2. And really, this is a addition to the story here that I simply don't care about. It's like, who cares? I really never once thought about where did the infection come from. I never personally cared. Like, cool, this is a cool detail to add. It definitely adds to the overall world and everything, but it's also something that I just never cared about. But here we also get another scene that was taken from the Pittsburgh section of the game that was transferred here, where they end up seeing some skull and bones in the distance, and Joel explains to her that these people were probably innocent and they were killed because there was not enough room in the quarantine zones. But this ends up taking us to a flashback, where again, most of the rest of the episode ends up following Bill back during outbreak day, watching everything from a bunker, and goes outside to see everyone gone, to which he ends up starting a society on his own. Again, this essentially feeling like the Bill that we know from the game, this individualistic person who ends up being self-sufficient and surrounds his city with traps. But we then cut 4 years later, to which is where the story takes a massive deviation, to where a guy ends up falling into one of Bill's traps, to where Bill ends up saving him, that being Frank. And obviously this episode ends up turning into this love story for Bill and Frank, which I do think as a whole works very well. I think for the story that it is trying to tell, it is a beautiful story, well portrayed by both Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett. though also a story that I do feel is largely unnecessary to the greater scheme of The Last of Us. Now, I get that this story is, again, encompassing this theme of love. It is also utilized later on to progress Joel's character. However, again, in the original game, Bill is used in the opposite effect to how it's used here. Bill is used to show what will happen to Joel if he doesn't change. Bill is this figure that pushes people away because of his individualistic nature. And through that, it ends up causing Joel to realize what will happen to him if he ends up alone. Well, Bill in the show here ends up being the opposite. He's supposed to show what happens to Joel if he accepts love from other people. However, for me, the problem is that this doesn't work within the actual story of The Last of Us. Where despite this talk about how we get this bittersweet ending of Bill and Frank end up dying together, I don't really look at that as a bittersweet ending. I look at that as only a sweet ending. It is a beautiful outcome for these characters. For Bill to have found love with Frank to the point where he recognized that the only reason he is alive is because of his love for Frank, and that without Frank, his life isn't worth living. And while yes, this plays into Joel's later decision at the end of the season, it's not an outcome that gives Joel the same outcome, which makes this entire thematic messaging here feel very wonky to me. But again, a lot of this Bill and Frank dynamic is really great. There are a lot of great moments between the two here, and we see the complete progression of their relationship from the first time they get together and Bill singing him a long, long time to cut to 3 years later and them getting into an argument and showing how Frank is changing Bill, which again is the opposite way that's handled in the original game. But here again, I think it makes for a great story to show Bill changing for Frank here. We also get this dinner scene with Joel and Tess, to where I will say I felt like Tess's portrayal during this scene was just kind of weird and felt very different from how she's portrayed elsewhere. But either way, these Bill-Joel parallels are done pretty well here. We're going to cut to 3 years later after that, where we get the berry scene of them eating berries and being giddy together. And though I will say I did find the eventual scene of raiders attacking them in the middle of the night to be kind of ridiculous, of Bill just standing in the middle of the street shooting at the raiders, which just leaves him open to be shot at himself. Again, I thought that was kind of dumb, but again, we eventually get caught up to the modern day where despite this like foreshadowing of Bill not being as healthy as Frank, it turns out Frank is the one that's declining in health. And this leads up to obviously their eventual last day of them getting married and sacrificing themselves together. And again, I think this is all just a beautiful story. It's just one that I think in relation to the rest of the season doesn't really work as effectively as I would want it to. I don't think it has the thematic impact to me as much as I want it to. And I, again, just prefer the original game's portrayal of Bill a lot more. I do like that cautionary tale a lot more than this more uplifting story here. By the way, after this, we cut back to Joel and Ellie as they arrive in Bill's town, only to find, obviously, Bill and Frank having already died, and him leaving Joel a suicide letter, which I will say, I really did not love this either, where we have Bill writing this letter talking about how Joel has to keep Tess safe. And obviously portrayals the Bill and Frank relationship as a parallel to the Joel and Tess relationship, which I really don't like. Again, to me, this minimizes the theme of how broken Joel is from the loss of Sarah, where it makes it feel like Joel's love for Tess is equal to that of his love for Sarah and eventually Ellie, which I just feel like makes the story not as impactful to me. To me, I really don't like how much importance they put on Tess in the show. Either way, now with Bill and Frank dead, the plan is to go find Tommy in Wyoming, because that wasn't the plan beforehand for some reason. And we have them driving off as the song that Bill sang plays. But again, I just feel like as a whole, this episode just continues to repeat on this theme of Joel failing to save those that he loves and how he needs to redeem that, which is something that just felt very repetitive to me and gets continued on later on. Even though, again, I do find the individual story of Bill and Frank to be a very solid one. By the way, that takes us to episode 4, which I did find to be one of the weaker episodes, especially when taking out the issues I have with other episodes for how they change things from the original game. I just feel like episode 4 here is just genuinely a very average episode of television, where it's obviously just part 1 of the Kansas City storyline. storyline, obviously a mirror of that of the Pittsburgh storyline in the original game, and again, it's largely just fine. I mean, I felt like early on we do spend a lot of time with Joel and Ellie, and I feel like those moments were pretty solid for the most part. Get a redo of the cutscene of Ellie finding Bill's magazine and joking about how the pages are stuck together, and that's still a good scene. Though I will say, again, I felt like the original was better in my eyes. We had the first appearance of Ellie's joke book, which is again is a cool reference to the original game. We also get talk about Joel's love of coffee, which is another cool reference. But eventually you get to talking about Tommy, to where we do get actually more details here about Tommy than we do in the original game. And a lot of dialogue here actually ends up being taken from the early portions of the Damn chapter from later on, which is kind of strange that they didn't just do that in the part of the story that ends up mirroring that later on, but whatever. But this is also where we get to, again, aspects I don't like of Ellie asking him why he's continuing going, and he says, "You keep going for family," which again, to me in the original game, he's supposed to find that purpose when he bonds with Ellie. He's supposed to realize that this is who I'm living for, instead of just openly living for family from the very beginning. I feel like this kind of undercuts his development. But also here, this is where we also get a ridiculous line here that was in the original trailer, and I even laughed at it then. And I remember when I heard this line, it made me extremely worried for the show, in that we literally have Joel calling Ellie cargo, which is just so on the nose. For Joel to explicitly call her cargo is just so ridiculous to me. But either way, moving forward, we have the arrival of Kansas City. Joel says screw it, and they decide to drive through. They get in an ambush. Same things happen as in the original game, though here the ambush scene itself ends up playing out slightly differently, where Joel tells Ellie to hide while Joel ends up fighting the guys by himself, to where Joel ends up being successful until one of the guys ambushes him due to him not being able to hear him, due to being partially deaf, which I will say that is something that, while it is a minor change from the original story, I feel like it's actually one that I don't mind. I don't mind this aspect of Joel having become deaf from the sound of gunshots, and I do think that's a level of complexity to his character that I actually don't have an issue with here. But this ends up opening up the opportunity for Ellie to save Joel here, saving him with a gun that she stored away at the end of the previous episode, which ends up mirroring that of a scene from the hotel section in Pittsburgh in the game that obviously was cut here. Though this ends up being a pretty gruesome scene, the guy begging for his life and everything. Though again, the way that Joel reacts to this ends up being slightly different. Where again, to me, this ends up showing a less hardened Joel. Where in the original game, Joel reacts to Ellie saving him with him being upset at Ellie for not following his commands, him still being unaccepting of the help that Ellie is providing him, which again can make you think, okay, Joel's just kind of a dick, but I do think it plays into his character. While here, this ends up being portrayed really differently, where instead Joel is sympathetic towards Ellie and apologizing to her for making her do that, which is a different portrayal of Joel here. I don't think this is necessarily a negative though, as I do think this is obviously showing this growing relationship between the two, and this does lead to Joel teaching her how to use a gun, as he does in the original game at this point as well. But throughout all this, we do also end up having our introduction to Kathleen, who ends up being the antagonist of the Kansas City section. And as a whole, I really did not like Kathleen's role in the story, where I get that you need this figurehead of this antagonistic figure to set up the threat of the opposing side within a TV show, which you don't necessarily need for a game. I get why they include Kathleen here, but I also didn't love Kathleen's role in the story as a whole. I do feel like she just comes off as, again, kind of repetitive to me, where the themes of Kathleen end up essentially being the same themes that we're going to later see in part 2, where she's essentially acting in the way that Ellie and Abby are going to eventually act in part 2, of her wanting revenge for the death of her brother and crossing moral lines in order to do so, of her killing this doctor in order to try to find Henry, which obviously just the overall backstory about Henry has changed, though we'll talk about that later. But I don't know, I just felt like overall this just felt kind of repetitive to me. I feel like it didn't really feel like a theme that we needed to explore here when we're going to explore again later. While you can say, okay, this is set up to that eventual theme, it also makes it feel kind of dumb that Ellie's even going to bother going through with what she does in part 2 if she knows that this is what happened to Kathleen here, but whatever. Also here we get introduced to Perry, who is Kathleen's lieutenant, who is played by Jeffrey Pierce, who plays Tommy in the original, and that's kind of cool. Though here he ends up showing her that there's infected under the city, moving underground, to which Kathleen ends up telling him not to alert the others yet, and him clearly being annoyed at that. Though again, once again showing how far Kathleen's gonna go to get revenge. By the way, we cut back to Joel and Ellie as they break into a building where they end up staying the night, and we get same dialogue from the game about how Joel's been on both sides. But we do get this pretty nice moment between Joel and Ellie as they go to sleep, with Joel finally laughing at a joke of hers, only for Ellie to awaken Joel to find them at gunpoint from Henry and Sam, and taking us to episode 5, which starts with a Henry and Sam flashback, where I will say as a whole, I did like Henry and Sam in their show here. Where Sam, I thought, was a massive improvement here. Where, to me, Sam in the original Last was probably the least notable character of the entire game, especially out of the companion figures. I just feel like he's one that never really stood out. While here, obviously, making Sam depth, I think does add a lot to his character. Now, I will say, in a way, it feels a little bit tropey, and the fact that it feels like it's kind of playing off the A Quiet Place trend. But still, I think it was nice to see a deaf character actually being portrayed by a deaf actor, to which, again, I think Sam was done very well here. Henry, I'm a little bit more mixed. I think Henry as a whole was very good. However, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like Henry's overall characterization was slightly different in the way that, again, for me with Ellie, what makes it strange is that they decided to make Ellie a colder, more hardened version of Ellie, as like the explanation being that she grew up in the apocalypse. Well, with Henry, they kind of do the opposite, and they kind of make him come off as a bit more unprepared for what's going on in the outside world, and I feel like that was just kind of a strange change to his character. However, I did think the actor that played Henry did a very good job in this role. It's just, again, another situation of me like kind of questioning the changes in characterization, but either way, this flashback ends up being a pretty strong one, really setting up the dynamic between the two, with, again, both of them coming off as really likable characters here. Though we do also cut to Kathleen, who gets more of the same content. I feel like this was also just repetitive here. It just felt like more of the same content we got in the previous episode, Kathleen, of her killing this group of people that give her intel about Henry. Again, just felt like more of the same. But I will also say something that feels weird to me is that this happens immediately after the rebellion had won their fight against Fedra, meaning that this is when Kansas City got liberated, which was just 10 days ago, which, I don't know, it just feels like largely convenient that it took them 20 years to break free from Fedra, and Joel and Ellie end up arriving in the city 10 days after that happens. But again, it's just a minor complaint there. And Kathleen later gets another scene of her talking about her brother, to where she talks about knowing that he wouldn't want her to get revenge, but she doesn't care, which, again, is just blatantly showing her themes there. By the way, we continue following Henry and Sam, and now show their point of view of the day that they end up meeting with Joel and Ellie. Though I will say, something that I did find kind of underwhelming about this episode is that I never felt like Joel and Ellie and Henry and Sam felt like this group that they felt like in the original game. And obviously that's because we spend more time with them in the original game. But I feel like by the time of the eventual Henry and Sam death, it felt so much more gutting in the fact that it felt like this was a team that was finally coming together and that they were going to work together moving forward, which I never really got that sense from the show, where everything just happened so abruptly that I never felt like these characters bonded as much as they did in the original game. But the next morning, we end up getting more background on Henry as he reveals to Joel that he was a rat to Fedra, and really ends up becoming a lot more meek here, in that, while in the original game, Henry and Sam definitely needed Joel and Ellie to escape Pittsburgh, here this comes off even more desperate, in that Henry comes off as really ill-equipped, and essentially is even bothering to team up with Joel and Ellie just because he knows that he needs Joel to have a chance at surviving moving forward. But here we do hear Henry's plan of escaping, where the plan is to escape through the tunnels, which ends up mirroring the sewer section of the original game. Going through the tunnels here, we do end up seeing kid drawings on the wall, and end up finding a deserted sewer community, just like we did in the game. To which again, there is this picture of Ish, which is obviously a reference to the game, the one that is largely insignificant. Though it is also here where we see Ellie and Sam bonding over a Savage Starlight comic, which again is another reference to the game. Though I did feel like the Ellie-Sam bond here did feel very endearing on the show. I will say that is probably one of the bigger positives here in that I do feel like actually Ellie and Sam's relationship was probably handled better on the show than it was in the game, at least until the final scene. But this is also where Henry finally truly opens up to Joel, revealing that he lied about not killing somebody and that he's the one that killed Kathleen's brother in order to get medicine for Sam, who is sick with leukemia. And again, this is kind of a tropey background. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from something I've seen in The Walking Dead Telltale or really a lot of other stories, but I do think it works here. I do think it's a nice recontextualization of Henry's character, and again, showing what someone will do to save someone they love. But eventually the group ends up escaping the sewer, to where we end up following this up by the sniper section, again playing out similarly to the game, though here at nighttime, where Joel ends up sneaking around and ends up taking the sniper down, this time being just a random old man who ends up alerting Kathleen to their location, to which they end up appearing not too long afterwards. And this is where we get the big set piece for the episode, where Joel ends up sniping down some of the rebels, leading up to this face-off against Kathleen, where Henry ends up giving himself up, to where she tells him that you think the world revolves around him and says that this is what happens when you fuck with fate, which is essentially just blatantly shoving the themes of the ending of The Last of Us Part 1 to you. Either way, we finally get to the infected arriving, where the truck behind them sinks their ground just as Kathleen's gonna shoot them, which is ridiculous. But the infected end up jumping out of the hole, attacking everyone, and I will say, a lot of people praise this scene. I did feel like this came off very over the top, especially in how quickly the infected really swarm the area, and we do get the first appearance of a bloater, which kind of just looked ridiculous in my eyes, where obviously they took out spores for the show, which again, a change that I don't personally mind, but through that kind of recontextualizes the bloater to just be this massive infected that doesn't really have any other special abilities outside that, so we just see it like agilely moving around and knocking people around, which I just found kind of ridiculous, and ends up killing Perry in a similar way to how it would kill Joel in the game if you die from it, which is pretty cool. But this all leads up to Kathleen catching up with the group right before they're about to escape, to which she gives her villainous spiel just as a kid clicker comes from behind and kills her, which I thought this was so ridiculous. Where this feels like another instance like the grandma back in episode 1 of they were like, oh, it wouldn't be cool if a kid was a clicker. And it also felt so on the nose with her literally having said earlier that children die only for a child clicker to kill her. And I just felt like this, again, felt like such an over-the-top moment to me. The way that Kathleen goes out here, making her feel like some sort of super villain from a comic book movie. But either way, Joel and the group escape to a motel, which all this ends up playing out similarly to the events at the radio tower in the original game. Though we really don't end up focusing at all on Henry and Joel, really giving them no downtime here like they did in the original game, and instead entirely focusing on Ellie and Sam, who do have nice moments here. And I think the scene works so much better than what I thought it would, in having Sam write down his questions and Ellie responding to him. I actually really like this entire scene, even though most of the dialogue does come straight from the game. I do think this actually elevated from the game until we get to the point where Sam decides to show her his bite, which this is where I really did not like the changes made here. And really as a whole, I feel like Ellie just comes off as kind of an idiot in this scene of her cutting her hand and putting her blood on his wound, thinking that that's going to be enough to miraculously save him, which just seems kind of idiotic. And for her to not even tell anyone about this either, but we do end up having her promising to stay awake with him, which she doesn't, leading us to the morning where again scene plays out similarly of the infected Sam attacking Ellie, though I will say I did not like how this scene played out either. I really preferred the original so much more. I feel like there's so much gravitas put into the original that isn't here, where almost instantly we see Henry killing Sam and almost instantly putting the gun to himself and killing himself. Where again, this is an extremely emotional scene. I just don't feel like it worked as well as the original game, where again, I just felt like it was much quicker than the original game. And I get that this is supposed to be showing Joel failing once again and that he failed to protect Ellie in this situation. Henry had to be the one to save Ellie. But again, I feel like that's a theme that had already been brought up and didn't need to be shown again. And also just as a whole, though again, I do feel like it just lessens the impact of the scene. Though we do follow this up with us actually getting to see Joel and Ellie burying their bodies, which again was not in the game, obviously. And I do think this is a scene that works for the show that wouldn't have for the game. I do think for the game it works a lot better for the cut to black to happen after Henry is shot and then us transition to the next season. Here I feel like it makes sense to not do that, obviously, and have this final scene for the episode of them burying the bodies and walking off. But again, overall, like an episode I did like. Again, I do have a lot of like nitpicks with the episode here and there, but I do think it still did the original story justice and even elevated upon it in Sam's portrayal as well. So again, I do think overall, again, while not perfect, I still did really like this episode. But with that takes us to episode 6, which I will say, episode 6 was an interesting episode for me in the sense that, again, I really hated the back half of episode 1. And a lot of those things related to Tommy and Joel's characterization around Tommy. So I had been anticipating episode 6, knowing that this was going to be the Tommy episode, to see how it was going to handle it. I will say, to me, this episode ends up falling into the same traps that I did not like within the first episode that we'll talk about here. But either way, we cut to 3 months later where we're in the winter as an old man walks into his hut only to find Joel holding up his wife. And I really just found this entire scene largely unnecessary. Like, obviously, this is supposed to set up the threat that's going to come up later. Again, one showing Joel and Ellie now nearing Tommy, but also showing how dangerous the area moving forward is, while also setting up that Joel's scared. Again, changing up his character from the more hardened version of him that's in the game. But again, I felt like a lot of this was more so just wasted time. It could have been utilized more effectively, but we end up leaving, to which we get more time between Joel and Ellie, with Ellie now wanting him to teach her how to hunt, to which we later do later in the episode. We also have them talk about what they're going to do after all this, to where Joel says that he wants a farmhouse with sheep, which is obviously exactly what Ellie ends up having in part 2. So that's obviously setting that up. We also have Ellie talking about her love of space, but also we end up showing Ellie as responsible here, where Joel ends up falling asleep and awakens to see Ellie having guarded him overnight, which obviously plays into her having to play this protector role moving forward. Now also here we see Ellie trying to whistle, which is taken right from the game, and we end up weirdly having them reach a dam, only for them to just walk by it and it not to have any relevance to the episode, which was funny because obviously in the game, these entire events take place at the dam, while here they end up going straight to Jackson, which is a shake up there, and it felt like that was only there to be an Easter egg. But here we see them getting ambushed by a group on horseback. So we get this tense scene of their dog checking if one of them are infected, Joel failing to protect Ellie there because they have to continuously mention that. But here we have Joel telling them that he's looking for his brother, to which Maria ends up riding up, asking his name, taking them back to Jackson, which I will say the recreation of Jackson here was pretty cool. I mean, it obviously looked just like it did in part 2, with even part 2 music playing in the background while going there, and that was cool. We also get the reunion between Joel and Tommy, but here we do end up having Tommy and Maria give him a tour, which ends up being a similar scene to the original game, with Tommy revealing that Maria is now family. Though I will say I really hated Ellie's portrayal throughout this entire scene, where Ellie just comes off as a massive dick here, where one, we do get this cameo from Dina in the background, which I will also say really weird characterization of Dina, to see Dina staring at her and Ellie being mean to her and Dina running away, which was like, that doesn't feel like Dina at all, considering Dina in part 2 is this like strong, confident figure, but also, again, like showing just Ellie in a negative light. And my interpretation is that this was done to connect Ellie more so to her part 2 counterpart of, again, part 2 being so much about Ellie having learned from Joel and trying to mimic Joel but not being able to do so. And I guess this is like showing her having Joel's personality rub off on her, but like I just feel like it just kind of makes her come off as unlikable to me. But to be honest, I will say the overall characterization of Maria I do feel like was done better in this show, where I did really like these parallels that they did bring between Maria and Joel, to where while again, I do question like how much these Tommy Ellie parallels are being made, I do feel like to use Maria as this Joel parallel works pretty well, as it does kind of reinforce this statement of how flawed Joel is as a protector figure. Either way, we still get Joel and Tommy having a conversation by themselves, learn that the Fireflies are at the University of Eastern Colorado, and Joel gets upset that Tommy won't help him out and going alongside him, which is where we get the reveal that Tommy's having a kid, which I will say, I do think this is probably a change for the better. I do think it recontextualizes Tommy's character in a pretty positive way there, and making it make more sense on why Tommy doesn't want to go with Joel. Though Tommy gets upset at Joel here for not being happy for him, which is where we get the line of Tommy saying, just because life stopped for you doesn't mean it stopped for me, which is a pretty great line there. I'll give him that. I followed this up with a scene that, again, I felt like was super over the top, of Joel seeing a girl from behind that looks just like Sarah, and he sees that that woman has a kid, and it's like, obviously this is showing Joel's PTSD over losing Sarah, and that this is what could have been, which just felt so on the nose. And really, that's kind of my issue with Joel's characterization here. And again, there's been people out there that have been upset at how focused the show is on Joel's PTSD. However, again, that's not my issue. My issue is how blatantly they do it. Where, to me, the original Last of Us is, again, a story that is about Joel's PTSD. Joel does have PTSD in the original Last of Us. It's just that they don't have to continuously tell you that he has PTSD. It is something that you can pick up on through his characterization. Yet the show really feels a lot more blatant in how it is enacting these themes. But following this, we do have Ellie's interaction with Maria, where she does eventually learn about Sarah, which again is a moment that we know of in the game, but we don't ever actually get to see. And again, I do like this scene as a whole. I do think Ellie starting to piece things together of realizing why Joel the way he is pretty strong. Though I do also question Ellie's behavior towards Maria during this scene, where Maria tries to warn her of Joel, which, I mean, I will say, kind of questionable of Maria to be purely judging Joel on things that he has done in the past. But still, I do think the fact that Ellie is like so negative towards her here is something I did find kind of over the top, and felt like another situation of the show blatantly having to tell you its themes of Maria telling Ellie to be careful of who you put your trust in, as those are the only people that can betray you. But eventually we end up having another conversation between Joel and Tommy, one that largely gets propped up as one of the best moments of the episode, though I am more conflicted on it. I mean, I do think, for one, Pedro Pascal gives a great performance during this scene. I think the writing of this scene is very strong, but again, it plays into my other issues in that, again, it just feels like the show openly telling us how Joel is feeling. It feels like, again, us getting this inner psyche on Joel without any real subtlety to this situation. Again, it just felt so on the nose that Joel kept on mentioning his failures of saving Sarah, saving Tess, his failures with Sam and Henry, his failure with Ellie earlier in the episode. It's like, I get it. And again, this also adds into this aspect of this less hardened Joel, of him being afraid, and that's why he can't take Ellie, which again is a slight modification on the original motivations in the original game, but I feel like that scene was just so much better in my eyes. And how Joel is putting up this facade of him pretending like he's doing Tommy a favor, and how he's essentially trying to sell him on the idea. I feel like that was so much more impactful to me than Joel just blatantly telling us how he's feeling. Though I will say, again, I think the aspect of Tommy having a kid does actually add some great context to the show here, of showing what motivates Tommy into accepting to this deal, of talk about Tommy bringing his kid into a better world. But this all leads up to the recreation of the scene that is probably my favorite scene in the original game, this confrontation between Joel and Ellie, where Ellie had listened in on their conversation and is upset at Joel for wanting to let her go. To which we do have their argument, to where Ellie reveals to him that she knows about Sarah, and Joel says, "You're not my daughter, and we're gonna go our separate ways." And again, this is one of my favorite scenes in the original game, and this did not hit for me in the show. I think this is a situation where I just think the acting of Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson in the original game was just so perfect, and I did not feel like Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey matched that here. I feel like the cadence of some of the things that they were saying was not quite right. I feel like the level of emotion and gravitas wasn't there. Like, it just did not work for me. Not necessarily that it is a bad scene in its own right, but again, I just do feel like the original was just so much better in my eyes. But again, we get another situation immediately afterwards of after Joel storms off, we get cuts to shots of Sarah, which have to blatantly tell us that, oh, he's thinking about Sarah here, and that causes him to change his mind. It means we can't have any subtlety in this story, like in the original. This ends up leading to the next morning where Tommy ends up picking up Ellie. Whereas they're about to leave Jackson, Joel ends up turning out to be at the stables as well, and ends up giving Ellie a choice on who to go with, which is obviously really weird considering the ending of the game, which is him not giving her a choice. But she instantly chooses Joel, and we have them riding off to where we have this, again, similar farewell between Joel and Tommy that has Tommy offering Joel a spot in Jackson if he returns. And along the way to the university, we get some of the same dialogue that we got in the original game. Talk about football, talk about Joel wanting to be a singer. Eventually, they reach the university, which I will say, in its entirety, I was actually surprised that they kept this in. Like, I really thought they were just going to cut out the entire university section of the story. I thought they were just going to have Tommy tell them that they're in Salt Lake City and just, like, not even have them bother going to the university. So I was surprised that this was even here, but it was also just kind of rushed. I mean, this just ends up being really abrupt here, and that they end up going inside the building to find a map leading to Salt Lake City, only for a group of raiders to arrive and Joel killing one of them, but getting stabbed along the way. And while they are able to escape on horseback, Joel ends up collapsing like he does in the OG, ending the episode with Ellie begging him to wake up, which, again, similar to the original game, I do feel like made more sense actually than the original game, where the fact that Joel gets entirely impaled in the original game always felt kind of ridiculous, and this felt a bit more plausible. And I will say that even though I didn't like the characterization changes made to Joel, I will say that I do think they really work for this scene. Essentially, this acting as this big tragedy for Joel, where him feeling like he wasn't good enough to be this protector for Ellie actually paying off here in that he is in this near-death situation now that really plays into the fear that he was feeling earlier. But as a whole, again, like, I think this is technically a good episode. I think the way that it is constructed, the way that it is written is good. It's just that for me, it's again knowing what the original story was and how much attachment I have to that original story and how much I respect the level of subtlety that is in that original story. There are things in this episode that do just really bother me, despite that I can recognize the appeal of them in their own right. But now for episode 7, which ends up being a bit of a different episode here, as it does deviate from the original game structure in the fact that we do get an adaptation here of Left Behind, which was the DLC for the original game, which does take place technically around this time in the story after Joel's injury and before the winter chapter, but again, it was never actually included within the base game. And while I do think if this was in the real game itself, I do think it would lead to massive pacing issues. I actually felt like on the show here, it was fine. I felt like this was a nice time for us to get this background story on Ellie to further develop her character. And I came out of this episode largely feeling kind of good about it, which is strange considering I have 2 major criticisms for this episode. However, I feel like I have a lot less smaller nitpicks than I do with other episodes, where those things seem to annoy me more from the previous episodes than these like major issues do from this episode, but again, we'll talk about it. As we do start the episode seeing Ellie having taken Joel to a house, which again, this is in the original game, though obviously taking out the entire mall parallels, though again, that was mostly for gameplay anyway. And one of the things I really don't like about this episode, how they handle this opening scene with Joel, we do see Joel telling Ellie to leave and go back to Tommy. In this position, again, as he nears death in his mind, he is putting more importance into the safety of Ellie than himself, which again, I just prefer this not to be here. I mean, for me, Joel is a character that what makes him so great in the original game is the fact that everything he does can be interpreted as Joel being selfish, as he is doing all these things for Ellie, not predominantly because of his care for Ellie, but more so because of his own satisfaction and his own fear of losing Ellie. However, I think here in this moment where he assumes that he is going to die and tells Ellie to leave him, while I do think this satisfies Ellie's story arc moving forward, I do think it takes away from Joel's, and I do have minor issues with that, but either way, we follow this up with the flashback sequence. And another major criticism for me is how they handle cutting back and forth between these 2 timelines. Where in the original Left Behind, I do feel like the constant shifting between time periods did greatly boon your understanding of Ellie's character and how she was influenced by Riley. and how it parallels to Joel. It does it all in a really satisfying way, and I feel like a lot of that's kind of lost in this. And because I don't feel like the Joel and Ellie parallels to the Ellie-Riley relationship really work as effectively in the show. Though I do think the Ellie and Riley relationship on its own right worked probably better for me on the show, which plays into why I'm so conflicted on this overall episode. Before that, let's start talking about the flashback sequence. Now, I will say, I do think the beginning of it is a bit slow for my taste. I mean, the section of Ellie being bullied by this other girl and punching her in the face, and then going to the captain's office. I did feel like this was a bit tropey. It did feel very much like they're just trying to continue the show. Ellie being this rebellious teenager figure that I feel like we've already seen enough of. Following this, we do get a pretty near perfect adaptation of the Ellie and Riley story in my eyes, where I do think this is an episode where, for me, Bella Ramsey really knocks it out of the park. And again, I've been critical of the overall portrayal of Ellie across the show, or I do think Left Behind did it very well, where in the interactions between Ellie and Riley, it did very much feel like the game version of Ellie. While also Riley's portrayal here, I think, is better than in the original. I think Storm Reed did a very good job playing Riley's character. That while the overall material was pretty much exactly the same as the original Left Behind story, I do feel like this version of Riley really stuck out to me a lot more, even though, again, the usage of Riley outside of the context of these flashbacks wasn't as strong. But throughout this episode, we really see a lot of the same interactions that we saw in the game, and I actually felt like the chemistry between Bella Ramsey and Storm Reed was actually stronger during these interactions. And to me, that's what really makes this episode still a solid one in my eyes, is how much I really felt this connection between these two characters. But we do have Riley sneaking into Ellie's bedroom. We have the same setup of the story of Riley wanting to give her the best night of her life. And it is also here where we do get to see Ellie's Walkman, which ends up having a tape of Take On Me from a-ha. This is obviously a reference to part 2 where she does sing this to Dina. While yes, technically it is probably better if they do connect this song to Riley like they do here, but to me it does kind of bother me that it's obviously such a blatant retcon. But anyway, we do spend a lot of time here on traveling to the mall here, which, I mean, to be fair, they do spend some time in the game, but it did feel like this was a lot more fleshed out here. Obviously giving a lot more time to really set up this relationship between Ellie and Riley, but eventually they do reach the mall. Here again, we get some great moments here. Again, we get Riley wanting to show her the 4 wonders of the mall, only for Ellie to instantly get entranced by an escalator, which is, again, a fun scene there. But again, we get a lot of the similar scenes of them riding on a carousel, to them being in the photo booth, and them playing the arcade machine, which is actually different here in the fact that they're actually playing the arcade machine instead of just pretending like they're playing it, which I will say I actually do like the original of this better, though it's not a major issue. So we do get Ellie being given the pun book by Riley, which is a good moment for them. And again, I thought all these scenes were done really, really well. And along the way, we do get a bit more expansion on Riley's character with the reveal that she was going to be assigned to sewage detail. And that led to her running away and eventually being recruited to the Fireflies, which, again, is a little detail there that, while not really a necessity, I do think it's a fine expansion on her character. But while playing the arcade machine, we do cut to an infected on the bottom floor awakening, which obviously sets up what's going to happen later. Though I will say that is probably another one of my minor criticisms of this episode, is the fact that, like, how did this infected awaken? This one infected that's all the way in the back of the mall that for some reason didn't awaken to anything outside of them playing this arcade machine. And also, like, how did Riley not find and kill this one earlier? Especially considering the later revelation that she's actually been stationed here by the Fireflies. Like, you would think that the Fireflies would make sure that an area that was supposedly filled with infected was clear of infected. So again, that did seem ridiculous to me. But to go along with that, we do get the reveal that the reason why Riley knew about the mall was because she was recently stationed here by the Fireflies to guard a stash of theirs, which, again, this is more of an expansion on Riley's role here, one that I get what they're doing here and trying to add more ambiguity to this Fedra versus Firefly dynamic, though I did find this largely superfluous. This ends up being added reason for Ellie to be upset at Riley here. This is where we do also get the reveal that Riley is going to leave for Atlanta, and this is going to be her final farewell to Ellie. And this leads to a pretty touching moment between the two. I do think this is a moment that probably hit for me more on the show than it did in the OG. This is where we do see Ellie deciding to leave, only for her to regret it and come back, where she hears screaming, only to find out the screaming is coming from a Halloween store, which is obviously a reference to the game, though out of order here, as the Halloween store was actually much earlier on in the story. Though here they end up consolidating the Halloween store and the eventual infected scene, which I do think is a change for the better here. Again, I think taking out the gameplay of it all, it does make sense to have these two scenes together, where they also mix this in with the dancing scene of them dancing to I Got You Babe, and all this is still pretty strong. Though I will say the visual of real people wearing these Halloween masks while dancing on the top of a countertop did feel kind of ridiculous. But either way, this is where we do get the big moment of Ellie telling Riley to not go, to which she agrees and they kiss. Again, a pretty bittersweet moment, obviously knowing what's about to happen. We're conveniently immediately following this, again, right after they kissed and repaired their relationship, the infected shows up to attack them, which obviously feels pretty contrived, though to be fair, that is a criticism of the original game as well. But this leads to the fight sequence where obviously we get Ellie ending up saving Riley, only to then realize that she got bit. And again, I will say, this is a scene that I think this works better than the original, where I will say Bella Ramsey's reaction to the bite here felt a lot more impactful to me. It did feel like this genuine freak out, where I did feel like the original, again, while obviously still this big moment, it still felt like more subdued than this reaction here. But also, again, unlike the original, in the opposite of what I've been criticizing the show for up to this point, there is subtlety to this moment, unlike the original. And in the original, Riley is the one that has to point out to Ellie to look at her arm, where here, instead, Riley doesn't say anything. She just looks at Ellie, obviously terrified, only for Ellie to then look down. Again, there is more subtlety to this scene as well that I do think, again, boons this scene. And this is where we do get the final scene between Ellie and Riley, which is still the same as the OG game, and still a great scene of Riley detailing the ways that this could end and say that they should be all poetic and lose their minds together, talking about not giving up the time that they have left together. And again, this is all a great moment. Obviously, this great parallel between Ellie and Joel's relationship, though again, I don't feel like the cut back to the modern day was handled as well here, in that in the original, this ends up being the final moments of the entire DLC, with us overhearing Riley's speech as we do see Ellie pulling Joel to safety, which I think is a much more impactful way to end the episode than what we get here, which has us cutting back to Ellie in the modern day, with her deciding to not give up on Joel, obviously, and instead searches the house for supplies, finding stitches, and ends up patching him up. Again, like being a satisfying arc for Ellie across this episode. Though I will say, I did find the actual ending scene of this episode to be a bit strange, where they end up playing the exact same music from the ending of Left Behind. But I did feel like its utilization here felt a bit awkward to me, where we do end up seeing Ellie actually stitching Joel back together, and they end up using this music over this scene, and music like swells as she's stitching him, and that just felt kind of ridiculous to me. I do feel like it would have been much better if we didn't actually see her stitching him up, and instead, as she starts to stitch him up, we cut to black and we get the music. I feel like that would have been a lot more impactful to me, but either way, nothing too detrimental. And just really as a whole, I did feel like this was a solid episode, and to be honest, probably one of the episodes I came out of with the least negative opinions on, despite still having these complaints along the way. Now for episode 8, which I will say as a whole, I am largely mixed on this episode. I do think there are some really great performances across this episode, but it's just another one of these that as a whole, I just think thematically, there are some things that are a bit off, while also me not liking certain scenes as much as the original. And straight up, a lot of that comes from the fact that this is a mostly faithful adaptation to the winter chapter of the game. I mean, it is a almost one-for-one adaptation, just taking out the aspects of gameplay within it. And while like on paper, I'm completely fine with that, as I do feel like that's exactly what this adaptation should have done, I think through doing that, it kind of makes the pacing of this episode a bit strange, where I did feel like the entirety of this episode felt extremely fast-paced, even though we did get more more scenes with David, focusing more around his group. I mean, we even start the episode with him giving a sermon and really giving David this new side to his character of being this cult leader. And I will say that's a side of David that I think is good on paper. I think it is nice to add this added level of depth to his character. And I do think this aspect of him being a cult leader does also kind of add to making him even more unlikable as the episode goes on, though I do think it does kind of take away from David's character in the sense that David is obviously a terrible person, as we will talk about. Though I think something that was lacking in this episode is that this version of David seemed to know he was a bad person, especially through his later talks with Ellie, in a way that, again, the original David was supposed to be this representation of how bad humanity can be and gives off this aura of him truly believing what he says, which this version of David doesn't seem to do that, which I did prefer the other interpretation more. Now, again, I think David is well acted here, though it's also just, again, a completely different interpretation of David. Having this more subdued version of David here feels more realistic, though I do think the other version of David felt a lot more menacing through a lot more of his run, though really I could see pros and cons for both. But either way, we also get introduced to James here, who is played by Troy Baker, which was a nice appearance there, though really James isn't really given much to do outside of what he was already doing in the game. I think he's more so just this representation of what the community feels about David, but really, I mean, that doesn't really end up mattering that much anyway. Following this, we do have Ellie going out to hunt, getting this deer hunting scene from the game. But again, here we still have David and James finding a deer and Ellie holding them up, which I will say, I do think this was a pretty solid scene of Ellie like clearly trying to imitate Joel in this situation and her having her voice kind of crack at the moment that she realizes she can ask them for medicine. Again, I thought all that was pretty good. But then we get to the one-on-one conversation between David and Ellie. I will say for me, this really came off as kind of ridiculous under this context when David reveals that everything happens for a reason and that he is the leader of the group that Joel killed a person from, which again, for me, what makes the original work so much is that you do spend some time working with David. Now, like you do get this gameplay chunk of you fighting off infected with David, which I think further bonds these two characters to make this reveal come off as a lot more impactful, while here it just kind of weird as it's literally just them first meeting and him revealing this not too long after that. And again, I also felt like it was extremely heavy-handed that we had to hear David say that the person that Joel killed was a father with a daughter just like her. Because, I mean, obviously. But after this, we do get a pretty chilling scene, one that, again, isn't in the game, and that we go back to David's group where they're in the lodge, and we see them eating a meal that they're told is venison, which, I mean, coming from the game, obviously we know it's people, but this ends up leading to the daughter of the guy that Joel killed wanting to get revenge only for David to slap her, telling her that she always has a father, which again is all just really creepy when you realize that he's talking about himself. And I will say this episode did obviously play in a lot more to this like grooming nature from David, where I feel like with David in the game, like yes, it is obviously there, and there's obviously the really creepy moment with Ellie that we do get later on, but it feels like that was the only time it was mentioned outside of a throwaway line of mentioning David's pets. But here it does feel like they added a lot more foreshadowing to this along the way, which again I can personally take or leave. But following this, again we have David's group finding Ellie, same scene of them shooting down Callus and getting captured. Obviously much more condensed in the fact that obviously there was more gameplay involved, though again it makes sense that they reduced that here. But they do end up really reducing Joel's journey to finding Ellie here as well, which I will say I do find that kind of lacking in the fact that Joel doesn't even seek out David's men here. They end up finding him, only for him to end up ambushing them. And obviously later we get the interrogation scene, which I will say for me did not work as well as the original game. Though again, that's probably just bias. I feel like it was perfectly fine, but just didn't really have as much of an impact on me. Well, following this, we do get back to Ellie with her awakening in a cage. And again, this is where we get the creepy scene that again is almost one for one from the game, though we do get a lot more dialogue here from David with him talking about how he has always had a violent heart and that he knows that she has it too. And he talks about his love of cordyceps and the love that they show, which I found really weird. And I get what they're trying to do with the cordyceps in terms of trying to connect them to the themes of love, but it's just weird. But again, like I don't love that David pretty much openly talks about how bad of a person he is here. I feel like that's something that I feel like the original David was more deluded in actually thinking he was a good guy, or at least gave off that impression. And obviously we get him touching her hand and saying that he wants an equal and a friend, which is all, again, just still really creepy, really making David this super unlikable presence. Also the reveal during the scene that this is a group of cannibals, technically, though, again, they changed stuff from the game where in the original game it seemed like they were openly cannibals, while here it's more so David is like lying to the group that he's feeding them human. And I actually kind of like this version of the story of that David is tricking his group into thinking they're not eating human. Though I will say, like, the way that Ellie finds this out is just kind of funny to me, of her seeing an ear on the ground, which just felt humorous to me. But obviously the scene does end with the same Ellie breaking his finger, and which, again, straight up, Bella Ramsey's performance throughout all this is really great. Obviously, it's very different from Ashley Johnson's. It's a lot more primal, I guess, in that it's a lot more raw. But I do think it very much works. Like, obviously, it makes sense that in this very dark situation, that is the way that she would be reacting to these things. But again, following this, we go back to Joel. And again, his entire journey back to Ellie here is extremely condensed, where in the original, he ends up fighting back a lot of David's men, obviously because it is a game. But even then, I felt like it had a narrative purpose. One, showing the lengths that Joel is going to go to save Ellie, but also to show the danger that David's group poses. While here, it's weird to me that, like, David supposedly has this group that we see, yet none of them are in really the rest of the episode, which does come off as ridiculous to me. But then we come back to Ellie again, another scene straight from the game of Ellie pretending that she's infected and biting David, to where that ends up buying her enough time to escape. Though this leads to a David fight here, which, again, all this was already happening in a diner, so they really consolidated all that. They didn't have this massive chase sequence with Ellie, which I think is fine. But obviously this diner scene is just extremely disturbing. And I will say the actual David stuff here is probably more impactful than in the game, where even though it is obviously very dark and very grim in the game, I do think there's still this level of detachment in the fact that it's still like video game characters. But I feel like in the show, this felt a lot more real, and through that, more disturbing to see David getting on top of Ellie. And again, Ellie's yells during the scene are extremely haunting. And again, I think the scene of her actually killing David here was a lot more impactful as well. But what wasn't is the actual ending to this episode, where this episode does end, like in the game, with Joel and Ellie reconvening, and Joel calling her baby girl. Again, this great progression of their relationship. But what I didn't like here is that this all happens after Ellie leaves the diner, which does feel weird to me. Again, to me, it's a lot more impactful the way it was handled in the game, where Joel is the one that has to snap Ellie out of this really violent state and pull her off of David. And to me, that makes this all more impactful than having Ellie gain consciousness and leave the building and then meets up with Joel. During which, again, I will also state, kind of ridiculous that this entire scene has no appearances from David's group, despite the fact that their dining hall is on fire in the middle of the day as well. So it's like, you would think that they would notice and do something about it, but I guess not. So again, overall, I found this episode's ending to be extremely strange, and I did feel like it was also kind of rushed as well. I did feel like the overall pacing of this was just very fast, and I feel like it just didn't quite hit for me for some reason, despite the fact that, again, I do think the performances in this episode were fantastic. Again, Bella Ramsey does a great job across this episode, and David is probably even more despicable than he is in the game. So I do think there are positives to this episode, but as a whole, I am left kind of just whelmed with it by the end. And now we're here at the finale, which was fine. I will say I did feel like, again, kind of like the rest of the season, did not have the impact on me as the original. But outside that, like, mostly stayed faithful, though felt extremely rushed. In reality, in terms of the plot points, it is mostly the same as the game. It is mostly same dialogue as the game. Just something felt off to me about the finale, but I didn't entirely dislike it. But we do start off with probably the biggest deviation of the bunch, in that we do get this massive flashback with Anna, Ellie's mom, being played by Ashley Johnson, as she's running away from a walker and arrives in a house on a farm. And I will say, I just could not get the fact that this is Ashley Johnson out of my mind. I just continued hearing her voice and thinking of her as Ellie. And again, this flashback ends up being split in two parts. And I will say straight up, I really did not like the first half, because I just feel like this is largely unnecessary. The fact that we see her having to fight back this infected just as she's giving birth and ends up getting bitten right as it happens, which in turn essentially explains Ellie's immunity, which I really hate, as straight up, it doesn't matter. Where yes, this obviously expands on the world building and explains why things are the way they are, it also straight up doesn't matter. Who cares how Ellie got immune? Again, all that matters is the fact that she is immune. And again, that goes with most of the added details in this game, is I do think it takes away from the subtlety of the original and the fact that it goes out of its way to further explain things or further show things that don't really need to be there. And then my eyes just take away from the base story. And also, I just felt like a lot of this scene was just also kind of ridiculous. The fact that she just somehow cleanly gives birth in the moment that she's killing this infected. And while I get the fact that, okay, to make Ellie special, something extremely convenient needs to happen here, it's also really dumb that we're being shown this to begin with. So I really did not like this. However, the following scene with Anna I thought was a bit better, where we see Marlene arriving outside the house looking for Anna and ends up finding her, obviously bitten. And we see her telling Marlene to promise to take her to Boston and take her somewhere safe. And again, this is all stuff that we already knew from the game, but they actually showed us here. And again, while I did like this scene, I think as a whole, it didn't really add much for me, with this really being exactly what we thought happened based on the information we got in the game, just with some added details in the fact that Ellie's mom was bit. But anyway, just in general, I do feel like a lot of these flashbacks just didn't really work for me as much as I would have liked them to. But again, it's still a well-acted and well-written scene. It's just something that I don't feel like was entirely necessary. But this then cuts us to the modern day, where, again, a lot of this just plays out similarly to how the game does. We obviously get a lot of focus on the Joel and Ellie dynamic here, where she's obviously distant after stuff with David. Again, very similar to the game. Though I will say, I personally think the game handles a lot of this just better. First, in the fact that it's Ellie's seeing of a deer emblem that causes her to be distant in the game, while here it just seems to have just sprung up on her during this random day. And then also adding in the lack of subverting of expectations here, where we obviously still get the eventual ladder scene that has Ellie not being ready to be lifted up, and that doesn't really work as well in the show. But here we still get, again, the same strong content from the original game of Joel seeming to be the happiest he's ever been, in contrast at the point of Ellie seemingly distraught. Talks about teaching her guitar like in the original. I mean, they do swap out the bus depot for a skyscraper. That's mostly insignificant. So here we obviously eventually get to the giraffe scene, which I will say the CGI looked really bad on these, but outside of that, solid enough. Again, well acted. I will also say, again, thematic messaging of it did not really hit as much for me. It's just in general, I thought it was just kind of fine here. Same thing goes to the rooftop scene, where again, pretty much one for one from the game. Though with minor changes to the dialogue that I did feel like were very heavy-handed, and her saying, "I know you just want to protect me, and that I'll follow you wherever you go," which is really my problem with the entire writing of the entire series. Following this, we get to them passing an army camp. Again, still kind of similar to the original. Obviously without the Sarah photograph scene, which I think is a major loss there. But instead, we do actually get a pretty solid change in my eyes. Though again, one that was written a bit too on the nose, of this revelation that Joel got the scar from a failed attempt at his own life, and through that is a constant reminder of his failures. And again, I do think that is a solid addition here, but one that, again, they just handle way too on the nose. And this following conversation with Ellie to me was just so ridiculous, where Ellie says that she knows why he's telling her this. He says time heals all things, only for Joel to say it wasn't time that did it, and then directly looks at her, which is just so on the nose. I will say, I do think the performances from Bella Ramsey, and I did feel like this was really off from the normal storytelling of The Last of Us, but I will say that the performances here were solid, so at least there's that. Following this, we get time for more puns before the Fireflies arrive behind them, knocking them out and taking them to the hospital, where here we get a almost one-for-one scene of the Joel and Marlene conversation, though we do get a little bit more explanation on why this surgery will work, which is fine. I mean, like, obviously that is a bit of a contrivance with the original game and how the Fireflies are so willing to sacrifice Ellie in that situation. I feel like they make minor attempts to make it better here, but not really to a significant degree. But we obviously have them taking him away, only for them to kill the guards that are escorting him out. And I did feel like the overall portrayal of this scene was a bit weird to me. where a lot of this just ends up being this pretty long montage of Joel just killing people with the typical Last of Us music playing in the background, coming off extremely fast-paced and also feeling a bit ridiculous that only one guard at a time is approaching him, which obviously makes logical sense in how Joel is surviving this, but also just feels really stupid that they're sending one guard at a time at him. Like, why isn't anyone waiting to find another guy to help them? But whatever. But particularly later on in this scene, we do get the use of All Gone, the song that plays while Joel is escaping the hospital in the original, but it's played here as he's killing people in the hospital. And to me, that did feel weird. Like, I just did not love the choice of music in that scene. Like, it didn't feel tonally right to me. But either way, we enter the surgery room, during which, again, the rest of this just plays out pretty much one for one. We have the doctor trying to stop him, only for Joel to almost instantly shoot him here, which I'll say just straight up, I was surprised they didn't do more with Jerry here. Now, at the end of the day, I don't personally mind it. I think it is probably better to just save that for part 2. But I was personally surprised to not see a blatant Abby appearance or more in detail Jerry. So I was kind of happy they didn't go with that approach. But really, they just kind of skip over the entire carrying of Ellie to the elevator, which to me is one of the more emotional scenes from the original game. And then we get the final confrontation of Marlene, being portrayed in a very similar way to the original, with it cutting back and forth. And again, having mostly similar dialogue and a couple minor changes, though nothing that is too egregious there. But again, all of it really not feeling as impactful to me. And again, obviously this is because I'm so connected to the original, but I just really not feel like any of this came close to matching the original. But following this, we get the final few scenes here of them driving towards Jackson, during which they end up playing the opening music from part 2, the music that plays while Joel rides into Jackson, which I thought was interesting. But here we have them going on a final hike. This all culminates in the same moment with mostly the same dialogue, where she finally reveals to Joel about what happened when she got bit and talks about Riley, and then also wants Joel to swear that everything he said about the Fireflies was true, only for him to say "I swear" and her to say "okay." And we cut to black. Again, this moment that is directly from the game. It's another one where, again, I just prefer the original a lot more. And again, obviously, a lot of that comes from my attachment to the original. I do not feel like this really did anything to elevate beyond that. And to me, it just felt like it held a lot less weight. And really just in general, I think throughout this entire story, I really just did not connect to the Joel and Ellie relationship as much as I did in the original. To where, again, the performances are really strong. You can tell there is chemistry there, though I just never felt as invested in this relationship as I did with the original Joel and Ellie. Though obviously this ending is still fantastic. It is still a very complex ending, an ending that I have a lot of thoughts on, it being probably my favorite scene in any form of media, one that I will certainly talk a lot about in a later video that I will be doing. Like, I think for this review, again, in terms of what the TV show does here, it doesn't really do anything to really elevate beyond what the original did, and through that, I just prefer the original more. Which with that, I mean, that is the entire season of The Last of Us. One that I am very conflicted on, obviously. I mean, it is a show that I was pretty excited for, and the fact that I am a massive fan of the original. And obviously, as you can tell through this video, I came out of it pretty disappointed. Not that it's actually bad, because again, it is not. It is a very well made show. I think it's a show that if I did not have context of the original Last of Us, I think I would have adored this show. But the problem is that I do, and I have such a connection to the original Last of Us. It is one of my most played games of all time. I'm literally in the process of putting together my longest video ever, which is a retrospective of the original Last of Us, releasing on the 10-year anniversary. I mean, The Last of Us is just a story that I just simply adore. And I think through watching this series, it really did make me realize, one, how much I do love the original game, but also how I don't think anything can surpass the original game for me. Again, as I will later talk about in extensive detail, I do feel like the original Last of Us is just straight up my favorite story of all time. And the Last of Us TV show here is obviously a retelling of that, but one that simply just isn't as good in my eyes. I think the writing is less subtle than the original. I think there's less time to really bond with the characters of Joel and Ellie, and there's less of this emotional connection through the lack of playing as these characters, but also mixing in the fact that I do think the overall story here is a bit tainted in the fact that I do think they do so much to set up part 2, including changing up the thematic messaging of certain scenes that causes the original story here to be a bit muddled. But really, I do think that is the justification for a lot of the changes that they make in this show, is that they are trying to set up the later events of part 2, but I do think for the original story that they're trying to tell here, I do think it makes it worse. But again, still not entirely bad. I still don't think this is a bad show. It's just a show that I have personal issues fully attaching myself to due to the fact that I am so attached to the original. original. And I think the show did very little better than the original in my eyes. With most of the things that they do that are quote unquote better are things that were just additions that didn't really feel necessary to the core narrative. By the way, that is my review of The Last of Us Season 1. Obviously, we know Season 2 is coming and more than likely Season 3. So I will probably be doing reviews of those when they come. Obviously, as I aforementioned, I do have a massive Last of Us 10-year retrospective coming out on the 10-year anniversary in June, which is on pace to be my longest video ever by a significant amount. I go in a lot of detail on almost every aspect of the game. So if you want to hear my thoughts on like the actual story beats themselves over how they were adapted for the show here, I would recommend watching that video when it eventually comes out in 3 months' time. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.